Imagine that one of the world's most famous cities is not a museum of history, but a perfectly assembled set. What if the Rome we're shown in textbooks is actually hiding not just secrets, but traces of a grand substitution? Why in the Eternal City do ancient giants stand alongside Renaissance masterpieces, while an entire 1,000 years seems to have vanished between them? Where did the era go that should have left behind palaces, temples, walls, and streets? And most importantly, who and why erased it almost without a trace? But this is only the beginning, because far more unsettling questions await us. Why do the fortifications of the Vatican look as if they were built using technologies that shouldn't have existed yet? Why does the brickwork in buildings supposedly separated by 1,500 years look as if they were erected almost at the same time? And why might the traces of the true center of a great empire lead somewhere completely different from where we've been taught to look? And then comes the most dangerous part. We'll approach the version that the Roman Empire was not a state in the conventional sense, but a vast financial system. We'll examine who the church might really have been, and we'll arrive at a hypothesis that will seem almost unthinkable to many, that one of the main shrines of the Christian world might conceal not an ancient feat, but traces of a very late, very loud, and very inconvenient conflict. If even part of this turns out to be true, then the entire official picture of the past begins to crack at the seams. All roads lead to Rome. We've heard this phrase hundreds of times and have grown accustomed to accepting it as an indisputable truth. Before our eyes immediately rises a majestic city filled with monuments of the past. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Roman Forum. Stone witnesses of an ancient civilization that we are told are almost 2,000 years old. And then a sharp leap. St. Peter's Basilica, the squares and palaces of the Renaissance. Splendor created by masters of an entirely different era. At first glance, everything seems logical. History simply flows from antiquity to modern times. But if you stop and look more carefully, a strange feeling arises. Between these two layers, there seems to be a void. Right in the center of one of the world's most famous cities, an entire chunk of history is missing. Ask yourself a simple question. Where are the buildings that should have appeared between these eras? Where are the early medieval structures? Where is the architecture of the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries? Where are the traces of the city's life during that period? They are almost non-existent. We are told this is due to fires, destruction, and renovations. But is it really possible that in the heart of a former empire, almost everything created over 1,000 years has disappeared? This isn't about a couple of lost temples or palaces. This is about an entire era that seems to have dissolved without a trace. Stone doesn't vanish without a trace. It is dismantled, rebuilt, reused. But traces always remain. Here, however, we see a gap that is too neat, too convenient. And the longer you look at this city, the stronger the feeling becomes that what lies before us is not a smooth history, but an edited picture. Two vivid layers, between which something is hidden or lost. And if that is indeed the case, then what we face is not merely a gap in knowledge. It could be evidence of a much larger and deeper anomaly that changes our very understanding of the past. But the more convenient this explanation seems, the more questions it raises. We are asked to believe that Rome, for an entire millennium, seemed to live in a half-sleep. It built nothing truly significant. It left behind no powerful civic buildings, no major temple complexes, no architectural language that could confidently be called the face of that era. For a city called the heart of a great civilization, this sounds far too strange. After all, even the hardest times do not erase life completely. Rulers change, trade weakens, conflicts flare up, but the city continues to breathe. People build walls, fortify districts, rebuild temples, expand markets, repair bridges. Architecture may become poorer, simpler, cruder, but it doesn't disappear entirely, especially not where power, money, and the memory of past glory have been concentrated for centuries. The official version explains this gap in almost the same way. Something was destroyed, something burned down, something was later rebuilt beyond recognition. Individually, such arguments sound plausible, but when they are used to cover not a decade, but almost 1,000 years, it is no longer an explanation. It's a screen. Too much has to be written off as coincidence. It becomes too convenient that precisely the period that should have connected ancient Rome and Renaissance Rome turned out to be the most traceless. And here is where it gets most interesting. When such a void appears in history, the answer must be sought not in elegant formulations, but in material evidence. Not in what was written centuries later, but in what remains on the ground. Stone errs less often than a chronicler. A wall does not conform to a textbook. And if the truth is still preserved somewhere, it must be sought where power has always been especially concerned with its own defense. Behind the walls of the Vatican. It is here that the first piece of evidence appears, one that cannot be so easily dismissed with the usual formula about losses, fires, and later renovations. It concerns the Vatican fortifications, those very walls that official history attributes to the early Middle Ages. On paper, everything seems clear. Threat of attack, urgent construction, protection of the holy site. But if you look not at the date in the textbook, but at the very form of these fortifications, the calm picture begins to crack. Before us is not merely a high wall separating one space from another. Before us is a thoughtful defense system where not only height matters, but also geometry. The lines are arranged to control approaches, block dangerous zones, and leave no convenient avenues for assault. This is no longer a crude barrier, but engineering logic that suggests a completely different level of military thinking. And here arises the main question. Why do these fortifications so strongly resemble the principles of bastion fortification, which, according to the official version, developed widely much later, when the role of artillery on the battlefield fundamentally changed? Old walls poorly withstand new blows. Military engineers had to rethink the very form of defense. And suddenly, we see something very similar where it supposedly shouldn't be. A strange fork emerges. Either the masters of that time possessed knowledge that was generations ahead of their era, or the walls themselves appeared much later, and their origin was then carefully pushed back into the depths of the centuries. Both options sound alarming, but the second explains too much. And yet, form is only half the puzzle. Because sometimes what speaks even more about the time of construction is not the silhouette of a wall, but what it is made of. And that means the next step of the investigation is obvious. We must look not only at the outlines, but at the stone itself, the brick, the texture of the material that holds memory better than any chronicle. And here the investigation becomes even more interesting, because walls can be rebuilt, shapes can be changed, but building materials often reveal the truth far faster than any official dates. It's enough to compare what is considered the legacy of deep antiquity with what is attributed to the Renaissance era. Between them, we are told, lie 1,500 years, a vast stretch of time, a whole abyss. But if you look closely at the brickwork, that abyss suddenly begins to shrink. The same firing character, almost the same shade, similar density, the same production logic, designed not for a small workshop, but for a large, well-established process. And here a question arises that sounds almost awkward. How could the technology of high-quality fired brick first exist at a high level, then seemingly vanish completely for centuries, only to return almost in its original form? We are asked to consider this the normal course of history, that after the fall of the empire, Europe lost much and later rediscovered forgotten crafts. But it's one thing to lose rare knowledge or a complex engineering school. It's quite another to forget a basic production chain involving fire, clay, and kilns. This isn't a priestly secret or a closed science for the chosen few. It's a practical craft, useful, profitable, and too convenient to disappear without a trace. Brick provides warm housing, speeds up construction, simplifies work compared to heavy stone. To abandon such technology in the European climate is like voluntarily complicating your life for no reason. And the clearer this becomes, the weaker the version of a 1,000-year memory lapse appears. So now we're not looking at one oddity, but a second. And when two anomalies start pointing in the same direction, a thought emerges that can no longer be ignored. Perhaps the glitch isn't in the stone, but in the chronology itself. When doubt touches one detail, it can still be written off as coincidence. When there are two oddities, it's already a pattern. First, fortifications that too closely resemble defenses from a much later period. Then, brick that seems to ignore the 1,500 years that, according to the official version, shouldn't exist between the buildings. And at this moment, the investigation changes scale. It's no longer about whether a single object is correctly dated. It's about something else. Are the epochs in the familiar history of Rome even placed correctly? If two structures, separated on paper by a vast temporal chasm, were created with similar engineering logic and using comparable technologies, a simple conclusion arises. Perhaps that chasm isn't real. Perhaps it never existed in the form we're shown. Then ancient Rome and Renaissance Rome turn out not to be distant poles of history, but much closer neighbors in time. This is already a dangerous thought, because what collapses behind it isn't just one textbook paragraph, but the entire familiar framework. If the chronology is shifted, then many buildings could have been assigned an age retroactively, some to appear older, others to fit into the required historical sequence. Then the city itself becomes a stage set, where dates play not the role of precise knowledge, but of a convenient legend. And here a question arises that previously seemed almost heretical. If in the very heart of the Catholic world we encounter such traces of possible substitution, then are we looking for the true center of the great empire in the wrong place altogether? Perhaps the city called eternal today became the main one not because it always was, but because it was once handed someone else's past. And if that's the case, the next step suggests itself. We must step away from the stone and look at the map. because geography sometimes exposes legends faster than archaeology. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," sounds so familiar that almost no one checks its meaning anymore. It has long ceased to be a conclusion and become an incantation. But if you momentarily erase the schoolbook image from your mind and simply unfold a map, the most curious thing begins. If we're talking about the true center of a vast world, a city to which the main threads of trade, power, and influence truly converge, does Italian Rome fit that role? Its location is beautiful, no argument there. But beauty isn't the same as strategic inevitability. The Apennine Peninsula stretches to the side, as if moving away from the main continental flows. To get there, you don't pass through a major hub. You have to deliberately turn off. It's more an important point within a separate region than a natural crossroads for a giant system spread across several parts of the world. And here another candidate takes the stage. The city on the Bosporus, Constantinople, the point where Europe and Asia meet, where the sea doesn't divide but connects, where any major route ends not at the periphery, but at the throat of the world. Through it pass trade arteries, military paths, flows of goods, people, and money. To control such a city is to keep a hand on the pulse of entire continents. That already looks like a capital not by title, but by the very logic of space. The longer you look at the map, the harder it is to shake off a simple thought. Perhaps the saying originally pointed somewhere completely different from where we're used to. Perhaps Rome, in its old sense, wasn't the name of a specific Italian city, but the name of the true center of power, which was later substituted in historical memory. And if geography so insistently pushes us toward Constantinople, then you can't help but ask the question that changes everything. What if the first and second Rome once simply swapped places? It's here that the version of substitution stops looking like just a flashy guess and begins to form a more coherent structure. If you're searching not for the familiar symbol, but for the true center of a large system, Constantinople looks too strong a candidate to be easily pushed aside. It's not just a big city on the map. It's a hub through which it's convenient to manage flows, gather influence, control exchange, and keep watch over several directions of the world at once. It has everything you'd expect from the genuine capital of a vast power. Access to key sea routes, control over the strait, connection between Eastern markets and European lands, the ability not just to receive goods, but to direct them onward, turning geography into a source of power. Such a city becomes a center almost naturally, not by a beautiful legend, but by the cold calculus of space. Against this backdrop, Italian Rome begins to look different. No longer as the innate master of world history, but as a city that may have been handed that status later, and handed it along with someone else's achievements, someone else's antiquity, and someone else's scale. Then, much falls into place. The sudden antiquity, the gaps in architectural memory, the strange necessity of constantly explaining why entire centuries seem to have dissolved without a trace. Even minor details begin to play in a new light. Old symbols, matching urban imagery, intersections of church and political tradition, traces of influence leading not where we are usually directed. All of this creates a sense not of a straight line, but of a displacement, as if one historical axis was shifted and then fixed in a new place. But if that is truly the case, then the main question changes completely. It is no longer about arguing where the real Rome stood, but about understanding something else. What exactly was that empire whose center might not have been where we were taught to look? Here, the picture of the past changes even more. Because once we stop viewing the Roman Empire as a familiar state with a rigid vertical of power, everything begins to look different. We were taught from childhood a simple scheme. There is an emperor, there is an army, there are conquered territories that obey the center. But such a model is too crude and too convenient. It explains the outer shell, but says almost nothing about how such a gigantic construct could have held together for so long. If we discard the official formulas, what emerges before us is less an empire in the modern sense and more a vast superstructure over many lands, cities, and rulers. Not a single body, but a complex network where the main role is played not only by orders and campaigns, but also by common rules, beneficial connections, agreements, and a unified system of exchange. And then, the legions cease to be the main substance of this system. They become merely a tool to support what was already working at a deeper level. At the foundation of such a construct must have stood not a sword, but a mechanism that linked all participants together. Something that made participation in the common system more advantageous than trying to exist separately. Common laws, unified norms for transactions, familiar forms of settlement, protection of trade routes, the ability to sell goods far beyond one's own land and gain access to foreign resources in return. That is what truly holds large spaces together. Then power, too, begins to look different. Not as a continuous conquest for conquest's sake, but as the management of a vast marketplace where order is needed first and foremost for the movement of money, goods, and obligations. And if that was the core of the entire construct, then a question immediately arises, without which we cannot proceed. Who controlled this order at the most crucial level? Who held in their hands not only the symbol of power, but also its main nerve, the flow of money? The answer begins to emerge on its own if we look at the Church not only as a spiritual institution, but as the control center of the entire exchange system. In such a model, its strength was built not on sermons and rituals alone. Real influence came from something else: control over trust, obligations, and the movement of money. For any large economic construct rests not only on goods, but also on who confirms transactions, stores valuables, records debts, and sets the rules of settlement. It is here that the Church appears in a completely different role. Its cathedrals, monasteries, and episcopal centers begin to look not just as places of prayer, but as nodes of a vast network spread across different lands. Where an ordinary ruler controlled only his own territory, the Church structure permeated many regions at once. It could gather information, transmit orders, accumulate resources, and ensure the stability of the entire system where secular power was constantly changing. The prohibition on private usury becomes especially important. In words, it is a moral norm. In practice, a powerful tool of monopoly. If private individuals are barred from large-scale lending, then whoever retains access to financial operations gains leverage over almost everything. The Church then becomes the sole force through which loans, obligations, large transfers, and the accumulation of wealth flow. And that is no longer just authority. It is control over the bloodstream of an entire world. Then the image of temples changes as well. Their massiveness, fortifications, and internal organization begin to be read differently. They guard not only shrines, but also material assets, documents, valuables, the very stability of the system. Against this backdrop, the emperor looks no longer like the supreme master of everything, but rather like an executor, a manager, the enforcer of a grand order. But if so, such a monopoly could not exist peacefully for long. Sooner or later, those who wanted to take this lever for themselves were bound to appear. This is how the old religious strife begins to look entirely different. If we remove the familiar textbook formulations, the Reformation ceases to be a dispute over nuances of faith. Behind the words about purity of doctrine, salvation of the soul, and the right to interpret sacred texts, a much harsher conflict emerges. It was a struggle for the right to control what gives real power: money, debts, flows of resources, and the trust of millions. The new monarchies no longer wanted to remain junior partners in a system where the main lever was outside their direct control. Kings could raise armies, expand domains, subjugate the nobility, but as long as the financial center remained in the hands of the church structure, their power was incomplete. They needed not just a theological dispute, they needed a breach of the old model, in which the church combined spiritual authority with monetary monopoly and thereby stood above any single throne. Then many things fall into place. Attacks on indulgences, demands for purification, protests against church wealth. All of this sounds no longer like abstract moral preaching, but like a blow to the very foundation of the entire construct. For if you deprive the old system of the right to trade forgiveness, collect payments, manage credit, and bind people through fear and dependency, it begins to lose the main thing, not its image, but its real power. That is why the conflict proved so bitter. On the surface, they argued about faith, but at its core was a struggle for the redistribution of the world order, for the right to decide who sets the rules, who collects the profit, and who determines the future of entire countries. And the clearer this becomes, the more unsettling the next question sounds. If the struggle was for power on such a scale, could the most inconvenient secret of all Christian history have been hidden right at its center? And here the version becomes truly explosive. If the Reformation was not only a dispute about faith, but also an attack on the financial core of the old world, then at the very heart of this clash must have been a figure whose significance was later completely reinterpreted. By this logic, the Apostle Peter ceases to be a distant figure from an almost unreachable antiquity. He becomes a participant in a much later drama, a man whose name was then placed outside of real time to conceal circumstances that were far too inconvenient. The purpose of such a substitution is clear. If a powerful reformer had truly emerged within the church system, one who opposed its commercial nature, its trade in forgiveness, its transformation of faith into a profit-making mechanism, then simply removing him from the political struggle wouldn't have been enough. The very memory of him had to be completely rewritten, not left in history as an opponent, but turned into a saint, safe for the power structure itself. And then the details, which usually go unnoticed, begin to read differently. The tombs of pontiffs, decorated not only with Christian imagery, but also with figures from the ancient world: Minerva, Fortuna, allegories that look less like a random artistic fashion and more like traces of an earlier, far more mixed system of symbols. Such a language fits poorly with the image of a strictly unified and unchanging religion. But it fits well with the version of a complex structure where different cults long existed side by side until a harsh internal purge began. If so, then the story of Peter could have become the main object of revision. a real opponent of the system, was turned into its eternal symbol. And the event linked to his tragic end was moved into the distant past, where details can no longer be verified. But if that's how an internal coup was concealed, then the next question is inevitable. What was such a gigantic operation, spanning entire centuries of world history, really for? Now the picture falls fully into place. Everything that at first seemed like a set of strange coincidences begins to work as a single mechanism. The missing centuries, the all-too-convenient void between antiquity and the Renaissance, walls that seem to come from another era, bricks that refuse to obey the official timeline, geography pointing somewhere completely different from where textbooks led us, and finally, the Church appearing not only as a spiritual force, but as the center of a vast financial system. Put it all together, and a version emerges that is both frightening and mesmerizing. The purpose of such an operation could have been extremely simple. It wasn't just about hiding inconvenient events. It was about creating a new picture of the past in which power would appear legitimate, ancient, and almost sacred. To do that, the dangerous conflict had to be pushed as far away as possible, to where it ceases to be politics and becomes myth. Thus, the real struggle for control, influence, and money flows could be recast into a beautiful legend of distant times, of persecutions, heroic deeds, and sacred succession. But any such substitution leaves traces. They aren't always visible right away. They're hidden in stone, in symbols, in strange gaps in memory, in the overly smooth explanations that the official version uses to cover obvious cracks. And perhaps the main conclusion of this entire story isn't even about where the real Rome was located. It's about something else. The past cannot be taken on faith simply because it has been rewritten many times in the same books. History must be examined carefully, coldly, and without fear of uncomfortable questions. And if, after this investigation, you look at the Eternal City even once not as a ready-made truth, but as a mystery, then it was all worth it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss new breakdowns of the strangest mysteries of the past. See you in the next video.